Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start. The 68th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 135 entitled 80th Anniversary of the End of the Second World War, to hold a special solemn meeting in commemoration of all victims of the Second World War in accordance with Resolution 79/272 of 4th March 2025. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on this 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we reflect on the immense sacrifices made by the millions who fought and died to secure the freedoms we too often take for granted. We remember them and we honor them. Their courage, resilience, and unwavering faith in a better future continue to inspire us. As time passes, these commemorations take on a deeper meaning. Most surviving veterans are now centenarians. The opportunity to hear their voices firsthand grows vanishingly rare. Preserving their stories is not only a tribute to them, it is a moral responsibility for us all. We must ensure that the lessons they leave behind do not fade but endure. Your Excellencies, the United Nations was built to save succeeding generations from the disasters of war. Its founders were not naive idealists. They were practitioners of statecraft, tested by conflict and forged by history. They had seen the world torn apart, and they resolved to build a framework strong enough to hold it together. When they conceived the Charter of the United Nations, our great organization, they knew that peace would not sustain itself. Peace would require structure. Peace would require vigilance. And above all, it would require shared responsibility. We are all required to build the global peace we desire, to reaffirm faith in human rights, to foster social progress, to raise standards of life in greater freedom. These were not abstract ideals. They were and remain concrete imperatives. Yet today, far too often, we see the principles of the Charter of the United Nations ignored, undermined, or outrightly violated. As conflict spreads and global peace comes under strain, we must renew our commitment to the Charter's founding ideals. If we fail to do so, we risk once again treading the path that led the world into war and catastrophe. The efforts of the founders of the United Nations and the sacrifices of those who endured and perished to deliver us a better world must not be in vain. I call on the leaders of today to choose dialogue over conflict, diplomacy over escalation, cooperation over division, peace over the absence of peace. We stand at a defining moment not only for this institution but for the whole of humanity. All humanity looks up to the United Nations. The choices we make today will shape the world our children inherit and the legacy we leave on all humanity. Let us choose wisely. Let us choose peace. Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, today we have gathered for a special meeting, a commemorative meeting of the General Assembly to mark the memory of all the victims of the Second World War. On the 9th of May, in an area of Berlin, Karlhorst, the final act on the unconditional capitulation was signed. Nazism was vanquished at its lair, Berlin, which was taken by the Red Army. On the 1st of March, before the Reichstag, the red banner victory was raised, and on that day, the Soviet General Chirkov was approached by the head of the general troops, general headquarters, who announced to him that Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker. The most horrific page in history was a tragic page, a chapter of history was turned, and the world was refrained from a step away from the abyss of the theory of racial superiority, where the value of human life was determined through the measuring of skulls. And what is important to recall that this horrific theory was not the fruit of Hitler's fantasies. This was born with European intellectuals. Suffice it to recall the theory of superiority, the essay on inequality of human races from the French writer Arthur de Gobineau. Colonialist racism, which was embraced by Europeans, was supplemented by Nazis with their radical anti-Semitism and anti-Slavism. And we can only imagine a world where such European so-called values prevailed. And this is precisely what happened. Nazism and fascism emerged, and they became popular. And in many European countries, supporters took power. And this is why Hitler's march was triumphant until it encountered the heroic resistance of the peoples of the Soviet Union. Let us recall that Hitler enjoyed sympathies and support from members of the British royal family, and Italy, Finland, Romania fought on the side of Hitler, providing 700,000 soldiers. The French Legion, the Spanish Volunteers, Norwegian SS Legion, the Dutch SS Legion, the Latvian Legion, which was particularly harsh and brutal. The Estonian voluntary SS fought on their side, and many Ukrainian nationalists also fought on the side of Hitler. In 1941, all anti-fascist forces managed to unite. The ideological opponents, the United States and the USSR and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, managed to, who had armed conflict in their past, demonstrated wisdom, and they stood shoulder to shoulder, and they set aside ideological considerations and did not attempt to equate fascism and communism. It was clear where there was good, where there was evil, and the victory came at the cost of millions of people. China lost 35 million people. The United States approximately half a million. Serbia organized the largest partisan movement in Europe. The struggle for the freedom of the peoples was carried out by heroes from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The cost for the Soviet Union was 27 million people. people, and 12 million people were part of the military losses. Millions of victims included civilians as a result of the policy of genocide, which was carried out by the Nazis, targeting the peoples of the Soviet Union. The war with the USSR had other goals than in Europe. On the 12th of June 1941, Himmler stated that the aim of the March on Russia was a reduction of the number of Slavs by 30 million people. Another laconic statement is attributed to the German Hermann Henrig, a successor of the Führer and the head of the Ost division, the Ost economic headquarters, and he stated that he stated in 1941, some people need to be reduced in number. Those holding power is in the Axis countries viewed the need, supported and understood and tolerated the need for genocide against the peoples of the USSR with their inherent pragmatic cynicism. The cost, they sought to derive benefits from the Black Sea areas, including Ukraine, and to send this abundant material to so-called forested areas in Moscow and Petersburg, from so-called forested areas, Moscow and St. Petersburg, to Europe. This was documented. This genocide was documented in the product of the Ost headquarters, document entitled Directives on Economic Policy for Agriculture. This was based on the work of the Nazi economist Herbert Backe. The U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, Whitney Harris, characterized this as follows. This document portrays the plan previously developed for the murder of millions of innocent Soviet citizens through starvation. This document clearly shows that the murder of millions of innocents was deliberate and planned ahead of time. This document shows that this plan for murder resulted in such a large scale, and the scale went beyond any human imagination. And in this way, the horrific blockade of Leningrad was carried out, claiming the lives of millions of people. And this was no accident. It was a result of the siege of the city. This was part of a deliberate policy of starvation. However, hunger is not the only weapon. Starvation is not the only weapon of genocide. As Hitler said, we're talking about fight for elimination, extermination. This struggle will be distinguished from the war in the West. It will be distinct from the war in the West, and in the East, brutality itself will be a benefit for the future. More than many people were exterminated and buildings were destroyed. Entire villages and towns were razed to the ground. We cannot recall the Belarusian village Hating, where 149 people were burned alive, including 75 children. And in these crimes, 200 Ukrainian nationalists led by Stepan Bandera were implicated, and they also became notorious for participation in brutal acts perpetrated during the Holocaust, including the July 1941 pogroms in Bandera, the executions of Jews, for example, in Babi Yar near Kiev, and in Sosin Ryad near the Ukrainian city of Rovno, where 23,000 people were killed. Nor can we forget the horrific Volyn massacre, which was perpetrated by the Banderites. As a result of this crime, 50 to 60,000 Polish civilians were murdered. And these the Soviet military prisoners of war endured horrific fates. They were starved, their bodies were exposed, and medical experiments were carried out on them in Auschwitz. The Soviet military prisoners of war were the first victims of the gas chambers, and nor can we forget the Ostarbeiters, residents of the Soviet Union, who were brought to Germany, and their slave labor was used by well-known companies, including Daimler-Benz, Deutsche Bank, Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, and others. And the slave labor was used also by ordinary Germans. They had announcements related to these people, and they traveled essentially selling them at slave markets in the 20th century. And the prisoners of war demonstrated a peerless courage as they resisted and stood up against these evils. The horrific Nazi atrocities did not require any evidence to prove them. They were well known as an axiom. However, the time has arrived, and the sacred memory of the heroes, of the victims of Nazism, is now being attacked by proponents of historical revisionism and revanchism, and the unnatural Nazi idea of dividing people into inferior races is now being whitewashed, and the supporters of this are being glorified. In Baltic countries, there are marches championing of the Hitlerite henchmen. In those countries and other Eastern European countries, there are monuments being erected to heroes who the monuments are being taken down, monuments dedicated to heroes in the victory against Nazism. And the Ukrainian, there's a Ukrainian slogan that is exactly the exact same as a German slogan, Deutschland über alles. This is there are monuments to fighters against fascism being taken down. Nachtil and Roman Shukhevich are being glorified. Stepan Bandera and henchmen are being glorified. There are marches being carried out on days commemorating the Nazis and supported by neo-Nazis. In Kiev, for example, a Soviet prospect, General Vatutin, a hero of the Second World War, this monument was taken down and is now being replaced by one supporting Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevich. We will not allow the international community to forget that the Nazism and the idea of Nazism is growing. There's growing support for this, and there are growing numbers of supporters for this ideology in Europe. Modern methods for bringing in supporters, including from young people, including social networks, are being used to bring in supporters. They're even managing to carry out athletic events, rock concerts, and lectures. All of this is not one-off. This is systemic in nature. We are closely following the situation, and we are publishing the relevant reports. There are attempts to demonstrate to us that supporting and glorifying Hitler, his supporters and ideology, is the exercise of the right to freedom of expression, freedom of belief. And yet last year and this year in Berlin on the 8th and 9th of May, near Soviet war memorials, demonstrations have been prohibited, not just with Georgian ribbons and military songs, but even ordens and medals and even uniforms for the victors are prohibited, including in photographs. Moreover, senior EU officials are brandishing threats of sanctions, and they're calling for people to visit Kiev instead. And so the question is, who will be supported and glorified and memorialized in Kiev? The millions of Ukrainians who heroically fought with the Red Army and who lost their lives in the fight to Nazism, or the Nazi henchmen of Bandera and Shukhevich. There is a need for clarity in this question because the victims and executioners cannot be placed on equal footing. I do apologize, says the speaker. It is noteworthy that honoring a commemoration of Victory Day, something which is not being done or rejected by those states who for a number of years have laid down obstacles to the General Assembly's adoption of a resolution on combating glorification of Nazism. Is it possible to even consider voting against this initiative at the United Nations, an international organization who, with its very name, which was founded by states members of the anti-Hitler coalition? We need to remember that victory not just freed people from horrors and suffering and brought victory, but also brought about a new world order under the central role of the United Nations based on the principles of cooperation, sovereign equality of all states, and non-discrimination. I will not be surprised if there will be attempts today to try to tell us or describe to us alternative history to the Second World War, where Soviet soldiers were irrelevant and there were communists. But on 9 May 43 minutes, a Hitlerite Germany definitively capitulated. We won the victory over Nazism, which you will not be able to cancel. Russia's commitment to preservation of the historic truth remains steadfast, contrary to attempts to taken by our foes. We will not, and we do not politicize the victory. We view this as a shared victory, and we pay tribute to the memory of all peoples of the former USSR who contributed to this weighty contribution. This included all peoples of the Soviet Union. All peoples of the Soviet Union contributed to the victory, including Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Azeris, Moldovans, those Baltic Kazakhs, residents of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmen, Jews, and dozens of other nationalities within our vast country this year, together with our allies, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, China, Serbia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. We initiated the adoption of a General Assembly resolution on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, in accordance with which the victory will be commemorated every 5 years. I will conclude with the words of General Zhukov, who is known as the Marshal of Victory. He is precisely the person who, in 1945, who accepted the capitulation of the German armed forces. With each year that passes, we increasingly move away from wartime. A new generation of young people has grown. For them, war is our memory of them, and we who participated in these historic events the war will forever remain etched in our hearts. We will forever remember the great feat that was achieved by the Soviet people. We, the participants of these historic events, this was a time that was exceedingly difficult, but it was very sacred. A person who experiences significant trials and who vanquishes this will forever draw strength from this victory. This is just for all peoples. Our victory in the war against fascism, speaking eloquently, is a part of that constellation of the Soviet people. We have gained tremendous moral capital. Looking back, we will always remember those who sacrificed themselves for the victory against the enemy of our peoples. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand, who will speak on behalf of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Thank you, President. I have the honour to deliver the statement on behalf of Australia, Canada, and my own country, New Zealand. As we meet today to mark 80 years since the end of World War II in Europe, we are reminded that few events have done more to shape the national and international identities of our countries. The values of liberty, tolerance, equality, and justice that guided us through World War II endure to this day. These values are shared by people from all walks of life and have shaped the fabric of our modern societies. We are also reminded that we are all here today, in some part, due to the sacrifices that were made by our ancestors during the Second World War. The Second World War was New Zealand's greatest national military effort to date, with over 140,000 men and women deployed overseas to fight in fighting formations. More than 1 million Canadians and Newfoundlanders fought in the war, with a similar number from Australia. We served in campaigns in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, North Africa, as well as in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. We honour our servicemen and women who bore the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of essential freedoms and the hope of a better world free from the scourge of war. President, the end of the war was a victory against a rising tide of aggression and expansionism that had threatened the world. And in the ashes of World War II, we built this institution with the UN Charter at its heart, with its fundamental purpose to uphold international peace and security and to prevent a repeat of the horrors of World War II. The multilateral system established after the war is, as we know, far from perfect. There can be no doubt, however, that it has made the world a safer and more prosperous place, averting and containing conflict and facilitating cooperation and development. Today, our multilateral system is under acute strain, and the world is uncertain and complex, more than has been the case for many decades. It is in this regard we deeply regret that Russia is now fighting a war of aggression in Europe. Russia's illegal and immoral full-scale invasion of Ukraine is completely inconsistent with the tremendous sacrifice of the Soviet peoples and the enormity of their contribution to the Allies' ultimate victory in 1945. President, as we prepare to mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, we are reminded that now more than ever, we need to work together to uphold the system we built together. A system underpinned by international law and the enduring foundations set out in the UN Charter. The Pact for the Future reinforced our commitment to multilateralism. Now, through the Secretary-General's UN 80 initiative, we must seize the opportunity to advance meaningful, lasting reform to ensure our United Nations can meet the challenges in front of us. It is upon us and our efforts in this hallowed hall to ensure that the horrors of World War II are never repeated. We thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkmenistan.
Ваше превосходительство.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations is dedicated to an event of tremendous historical significance, the victory over fascism during the Second World War. This victory has brought us together and set the stage for the founding of the United Nations. It established the bedrock for the system of international security, which is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The Second World War was the most devastating in the history of humankind. It has left a profound scar in the fates of peoples and has prompted all of us to draw the main principled lesson, namely, there must be no Third World War. It is absolutely clear that there will be no victors here, only human civilization which will lie in ruins. The victory during the Second World War was made possible thanks to the peerless resilience, courage, unity of all the peoples of the USSR and the anti-Hitlerite coalition, the inevitable victims of war and the fight against the Nazi threat. My country, Turkmenistan, also contributed with dignity to this victory. We stood up in protection of peace and justice. We have battalions that were put together, the 87th Division and 128th Division was put together, as well as the 97th and 98th Cavalry Divisions. More than 30,000 of the finest daughters and sons and daughters of the Turkmenistan went to the front. Of them, 13,000 were commemorated with medals and ordens, and 11 became were received significance, and they are remembered to this date. The defeat of the Turkmen peoples was demonstrated not just in the front, but also in the rear. The Ashgabat Railway transformed into a key road which linked the areas beyond the Caucasus to the front and central countries. The munitions were being delivered in this way, as well as equipment and other necessary equipment for parachutes and other necessities. And Turkmenistan provided cotton, grain, as well as food, meat, and other necessary products. The residents of the Republic contributed significantly to the establishment of the Defense Fund. Women contributed silver and gold, and this helped to build 5 tank convoys. And women of Turkmenistan made a weighty contribution here, replacing the men who went to the front. They took up key positions. In 1945, women comprised 59% of the workers, and in agriculture, more than 70% of the workforce. They contributed significantly with and carried out the traditionally male professions. This heroism, this selflessness, became the embodiment of the indomitable spirit of the peoples of Turkmenistan. Our contribution to the victory includes thousands of heroes and millions of nameless persons who remain etched in our memory. Each of us representing our countries at the General Assembly, representing our peoples, we do not have the right to forget these figures. We do not have the right to forget the lessons of this brutal war. We have an obligation to safeguard and preserve the memory of the victims and to counter new threats, supporting the key role of the United Nations in this process. However, there's a need also to remember that there is a need to protect what was the peace that was won at a high price 80 years ago, to counter falsification of history, to strengthen respect for the feats of those who liberated the world of the scourge. And this is the main lesson of the Second World War. The lessons need to be preserved and passed on. The role of diplomacy in this process is of key significance. Leaders, statesmen, states, and their leaders, their wisdom and their ability to facilitate dialogue will determine whether or not the tragedies of the past will be repeated. In the General Assembly resolution, there's a General Assembly resolution at Turkmenistan's initiative to proclaim 2025 the International Year of Peace and Trust. Under these present-day conditions of global instability, this resolution focuses states members of the United Nations, calls upon them to pool efforts to build and strengthen trust-based relations and to advance a peaceful political dialogue. This global campaign to strengthen peace and security is a continuation of the tradition of the International Year of Dialogue as a guarantee for peace 2023 and the International Year for Peace and Trust 2021. Today, terrorism, violence, propaganda of war continue to pose a threat to us. The only way to resist this is to stand together and to remember and to respect history. This session, marking the 80th anniversary of the victory, provides us with such an opportunity. This date is a reminder of the cost of peace and the mission which the mission that the UN has been carrying out carrying out over the past 8 decades. We pay tribute to all of those who contributed to the victory during the Second World War. Congratulations on Victory Day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkmenistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, who will speak on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter.
Señor Presidente.
President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, whose member states join the international community in solemnly commemorating the 80th anniversary of the historic victory of We the Peoples over Nazism, fascism, and militarism in the Second World War. We take this opportunity, first and foremost, to reflect not only on the sacrifices of the past and to honor all victims of that devastating global conflagration, but also on the enduring responsibility of the international community and the United Nations as a whole to uphold the principles that emerged from that pivotal moment in history. President, 80 years ago, states which declared themselves the United Nations achieved a historic victory. We must therefore not forget the fundamental value of the judgment delivered by the Nuremberg Tribunal and the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in the shaping of the international order based on international law. In marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we should remember all those from different countries and continents who sacrificed their lives to eliminate Nazism, fascism, and militarism, to remember all those who fell in battles, died of wounds, exhaustion, to remember all those who were tortured to death in camps, holding prisoners captive. The murder and ill-treatment of civilian people by Nazis reached its height in relation to the civilians of the Soviet Union, being a part of the plan to get rid of whole native populations by expulsion and annihilation. We therefore acknowledge that these heinous crimes must be regarded as an act of genocide against the peoples of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, this meeting provides us also with a privileged opportunity to pay tribute to millions of people, men, women, and children, who contributed to the fight against Nazism by their daily heroic work in the home front, and who resisted the Nazi military machine, as well as to people in the war-stricken societies who suffered or lost their lives due to famine and diseases resulting from the scourges of the war. We also note in this context that the Second World War had deleterious impacts on many other countries that were not involved in the war, and their peoples, who suffered immensely during those years. President, at this critical juncture and with the lessons of history in mind, we are convinced that it is of the utmost importance to reaffirm the central role of multilateralism as embodied in the United Nations, which continues to stand as the most effective means to tackle today's complex global challenges and to prevent the recurrence of large-scale armed conflicts. The legacy of the Second World War compels us to renew and deepen international cooperation, grounded in mutual respect, sovereign equality, and the inalienable rights of all nations, especially in an era where unilateralism and exceptionalism are re-emerging in new and troubling forms. We must remind ourselves that the desire to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war inspired states to establish the United Nations, which predetermined for a long time the development of contemporary international relations and the future of our civilization as a whole. While the past decades have revealed that this system is not perfect, it is important to underscore that it has managed to prevent new global catastrophes while also defining the contemporary world order aimed at maintaining international peace and security and promoting friendly relations among nations and countries. Nonetheless, there is an urgent need to reform the current unjust international order to address the persistent inequalities that pose an extraordinary burden on developing countries. In this vein, our group of friends underscores the importance of remembering the lessons of the Second World War and preserving the historic truth. Indeed, we note that millions of people fought together to rid the world of Nazism, and further note that none of the members of the anti-Hitler coalition ever doubted in recognizing dangerous supremacism, fascism, and arrogant exceptionalism as the true and sole enemy. Accordingly, we reject politically motivated attempts to rewrite the outcomes of the Second World War, or to revise the judgments of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The manipulation of history for political gain constitutes a serious obstacle to international peace and stability, and, more importantly, to reconciliation. Far from being harmless, revisionist narratives dishonor the memory of those who perished, while also fostering division and mistrust among nations. As both responsible members of the international community and peace-loving nations, we must stand firm against such distortions, working collectively to preserve historical truth and to nurture a genuine culture of peace. President, the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations further stresses the importance of upholding the tradition to commemorate anniversaries of the end of the Second World War, as it was established and as it used to be observed in the United Nations. We are convinced that such events should unite us rather than draw us apart. For only through the joint efforts of the international community as a whole can we effectively address present-day challenges and threats. As we commemorate this milestone in human history, we do not merely pay tribute to the past. We also sound a call to conscience in the present, for the sake of those future generations to whom we have been talking extensively in recent years, the sacrifices made by millions in the struggle against Nazism and fascism compel us to defend the principles for which they gave their lives. These are not abstract ideals, but living commitments to peace over war, cooperation over domination, and sovereignty over subjugation. At this current inflection point, we need to safeguard what unites us, which has the UN Charter at its core. Let us therefore not falter in this duty, at a time when new forms of hegemony and coercion threaten to undo the very foundations of the international order built after the Second World War, enshrined in the very tenets of the United Nations Charter. Our group stands united in defense of truth, justice, and that historical treaty that bound us together. History will judge us, will judge not only the battles we remember, but also the courage we show today in safeguarding the peace that was won with so much sacrifice, pain, and hope for a better world. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union, who will speak on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, members of the European Economic Area, as well as San Marino align themselves with this statement. Colleagues, the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a profoundly tragic chapter in the history of Europe and the world, is a moment for reflection and commemoration. It is the occasion to honor the sacrifices made and to mourn the countless lives lost during and after the war. It is also an opportunity to reiterate our commitment to collaborating with all member states of the United Nations to ensure a more peaceful, equitable, and prosperous future for generations to come. A future with the use of force and aggression to subjugate independent nations, where the strong abuse their power to replace democracy with authoritarian rule, and where hatred is weaponized to disenfranchise and even to exterminate entire peoples, is unequivocally condemned and consigned to history by the peaceful force of the UN Charter and international law. We pay tribute to the historic role of the Allied forces and their sacrifices in the defeat of Nazism. We also recall that the Second World War brought about painful divisions in Europe itself, and that many Europeans, the end of the war brought not freedom, but further subjugation and more crimes against humanity. As we reflect on this solemn anniversary, we are confronted with the painful reality that war has returned to the European continent. The EU reiterates its resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter, and reaffirms its continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We recall the resolutions of this General Assembly, calling for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter. To build a common future, dear colleagues, we must also be cognizant of how our history informs the present. It is crucial that initiatives commemorating the Second World War remain committed to historical truth and reconciliation. Now, unfortunately, in this room today, we already witnessed a flood of historical distortions, of hateful speech, divisive rhetoric by the first speaker. We emphasize, in line with the UN Charter, that there can be no justification for an aggression against an attempted annexation of part of an independent, free, and peaceful UN member state. The effort to equate the invasion against Ukraine with the fight against Nazism is a vilest example of distortion of history, and frankly, a terrific offense to the memory of the victims of Nazism in the Second World War. Colleagues, the UN Charter was the essential response to the tragic legacy of the Second World War, and so are the Geneva Conventions. We must recall that across continents, conflicts and wars continue to fester, demanding a collective response to guarantee peace and human rights. 80 years on from the end of the Second World War, we are reminded of the solemn responsibility entrusted to us to remain true to a collective commitment to uphold the principles of the UN Charter and to ensure that the horrors of the war are never repeated. The European Union is itself a peace project created in the aftermath of the Second World War to ensure armed conflict would never again be used as an alternative to dialogue and cooperation. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the universal respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. We unequivocally condemn all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, and discrimination, and call for further action to combat these phenomena. Holocaust remembrance is a key element for promoting tolerance, mutual understanding, cultural heritage, and intercultural dialogue. In closing, Mr. President, as we honor the memory of those who suffered and perished in the Second World War, let us recommit ourselves to defending the international order based on international law with the United Nations at its core. Let us promote peace in all its dimensions and reaffirm our determination to promote multilateral solutions based on the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tajikistan to speak on behalf of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, on behalf of the states parties to the Commonwealth of Independent States, specifically Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, as well as Tajikistan, we congratulate the participants of this special commemorative meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazism, fascism, and militarism during the Second World War. The peoples of the states parties to the CIS pay tribute to this sacred date. We remember this as a symbol of unity, courage, and a peerless sacrifice for the sake of peace on earth. A victory was won through the forces of the anti-Hitlerite coalition with the invaluable contribution of the multinational Soviet population, which marked the triumph of humanism over misanthropic ideologies. Today, our shared responsibility is as follows: to preserve the historic memory of the tragic events which transpired during those years, the feats of millions of people who fought for and died in the name of freedom and the future. We reject attempts to revise or distort the outcomes of the Second World War, as well as the downplaying of the roles of the peoples of states parties of the CIS and the participants in liberation movements in European countries in the defeat of Nazism. This is a position in principle which has been enshrined in what was adopted on 8 October 2024, a call on from member states of the CIS to peoples of the Commonwealth and the international community in connection with the 80th victory of the Soviet people's victory during the Great Patriotic War in 1945 to from 1941, corrects the speaker, to 1945. Our heads of state inter alia called for the principal assessments to be borne in mind related to the criminal activities of Nazi leaders. These have been rendered in the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal and reaffirmed in the General Assembly of the United Nations. We stress that the expulsion and extermination by Nazis and their henchmen of peaceful populations have been set out in the judgments and the rulings of the International Tribunal. It needs to be viewed as a genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union. Attempts to place equal responsibility for the outbreak of the war in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are immoral. They are sacrilegious vis-a-vis the memory of those who liberated the world of the brown-shirted plague. The attempts to justify the perpetrators of the war are sacrilegious, and we call upon the international community to firmly reject the glorification of the Nazi, fascist, and other nationalist movements, as well as their supporters. At the same time, we call for condemnation of and accountability for those who trample upon the memory of the victors. We welcome the General Assembly resolution on the fight against the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices which further escalation of contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, as well as related intolerance. And we extend our full commitment to the purposes and the principles of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Madam President, 2025 has been marked is the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Great Patriotic War. That a victory. All states in the CIS are carrying out commemorative events to entrench a historic memory and to develop international cooperation for the advancement of peace. On the basis of the plan of events to prepare for and commemorate in 2025 this date in the CIS, CIS, we have developed national documents with a focus on providing specialized assistance to veterans as well as educational programs being carried out. And this is in order to preserve and pass on the historic memory. We believe that the preservation of peace and combating manifestations of racism, fascism, and militarism is our shared priority. Thank you for your attention. I thank the distinguished representative of Tajikistan, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. In May 1945, 80 years ago, the guns fell silent in Europe. The war was over, but the continent lay in ruins. From the rubble of that devastation, a new world began to take shape. The war, unleashed by Nazi Germany, caused immeasurable suffering in Europe and beyond. That legacy of pain, destruction, and loss will forever be tied to my country's name. We carry this burden with humility and a moral responsibility, and we accept it without hesitation. The United Nations was born out of this catastrophe, and today, in this chamber, on behalf of Germany, I bow my head in remembrance of the millions who perished, men, women, and children from countless nations and communities, both soldiers and civilians alike. We mourn them, we remember them, and we ask for forgiveness, knowing well that the horror inflicted can never be undone. The crimes of the Nazi regime have no parallel. The murder of 6 million Jews in the Shoah, the war crimes in Eastern Europe, the mass persecution and killings of Roma and Sinti, LGBTIQ+ individuals, persons with disabilities, political dissidents, and all those who dare to speak up or simply be or act different. These atrocities will forever mark our history. Germany has embraced its responsibility for these crimes and will continue to do so. Our nation's history compels us to keep memory alive, not only through words, but through actions. Especially now, as the number of survivors grows ever smaller, the duty of remembrance and the duty of vigilance is ours. Crucially, remembrance must be paired with justice. The Nuremberg trials, held in the immediate aftermath of the war, marked a turning point in international law. For the first time, political and military leaders were held individually accountable for crimes against humanity. Nuremberg laid the foundation for transitional justice and for the development of modern international criminal law. It established the principle that those who commit atrocities cannot count on impunity. Germany continues to uphold that principle. Today, we stand firmly behind international justice mechanisms, from our strong support for the International Criminal Court to our contributions to special tribunals and international accountability efforts. We believe that justice is not only a matter of the past, but a pillar of peace, reconciliation, and deterrence in our world today. President, for my country and its people, the end of the war was a day of liberation. It was a turning point for Germany, spiritually and politically, a call to face to our past, not to suppress or shy away from it, and to build a democratic identity rooted in human dignity and human rights. 1945 was not just an end, it was a beginning of international cooperation, of rules replacing brute force, of nations choosing peace and collaboration over vengeance and confrontation. The decades following 1945 unfolded in ways few could have imagined. France, Poland, and our neighboring nations that suffered severely under German occupation are Germany's closest partners and friends today. From a continent reduced to rubble, a peaceful and united Europe began to take shape, committed to democracy, economic integration, and collective security. In an act of extraordinary courage and humanity, Israel reached out to Germany only 2 decades after the Shoah, forging diplomatic relations that have led to 60 years of partnership. In 1973, both German states were admitted to the United Nations as proud members of this organization, and in 1990, a reunified Germany returned to the world stage fully sovereign and supported by the very nations that had once been its enemies. These milestones in German history should serve today as a reminder and a message of hope that the deepest trenches can eventually be overcome. Even after the darkest of times, forgiveness, reconciliation, and the restoration of trust are possible, if they are grounded in the full and unreserved acknowledgement of the crimes committed. Only on this basis will peace and prosperity become a reality. That is why Germany's commitment to the United Nations and the maintenance of international peace and security is unwavering. Never again means never again alone, never again indifferent, but always vigilant. It means defending the principles of international law, supporting those who face injustice, and building bridges across divides. It means standing up together for dignity, humanity, and peace. It also means speaking up when historical facts are purposefully distorted or misused for political ends, particularly when such narratives are invoked to justify the use of force against a sovereign state. We must not allow history to be weaponized. President, never again is not only a commitment for Germany, it is a universal obligation, one that binds us all. An obligation to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to protect civilian lives and defend the vulnerable, to uphold the dignity of every human being, and to safeguard the principles of the United Nations Charter for all, including future generations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Madam President, as we mark the horrors of the Second World War, during which humanity have known the worst violations and during which human rights were violated, we stand today in commemoration of the millions who fell during that war among civilians and military. Egypt was among the countries which witnessed one of the battles of that war in 1942 in the northwestern of Egypt along the Mediterranean shores. And according to estimates, 20,000 soldiers died in that battle. And Egypt still honors them today. Numerous others were injured, and that battle left human injuries and constituted an obstacle hindering development in Egypt for decades. It also killed several civilians as a result of the devastating consequences of landmines which were planted on the Egyptian soil in the battlefield. Egypt has made tremendous efforts to remove those mines and to promote development in that precious part of the Egyptian territories. These efforts led to officially inaugurating the Alamein city in 2018 as a heritage, cultural, and tourism center for the whole world. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam President, marking this anniversary should not be limited to remembrance. It is a call to reflect over our collective responsibilities to prevent the recurrence of these tragedies and to spare no effort to make sure that conflicts will not happen again, to prevent them, including by upholding the principles of dialogue and the peaceful settlement of conflicts, and by dealing with the root causes of conflicts. The word has shown a true will to establish an international order promoting peace and guaranteeing human rights, protecting peoples from the scourge of colonialism and occupation. This is how the UN was created, after we agreed on the UN Charter, which upheld the principles of justice, humanity, equality, and human rights. Egypt was one of the founding members of our organization, and it has always played a pioneering role in supporting peace and calling for peace, a peace built on the principles of justice, equity, balance, commitment to the principles and goals of the United Nations, out of our belief that the world has room for everyone and that collaboration for development is the best and most effective choice. Madam President, out of our steadfast commitment to the principles and goals of the UN Charter, and as we mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we would like to draw your attention again to what the brotherly Palestinian people is living today in the occupied Palestinian territories in Gaza, to their ongoing suffering and to the blatant, horrible violations of international humanitarian law and the resolutions of international legitimacy. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank are witnessing unimaginable violence and destruction and a deliberate deprivation of the brotherly Palestinian people of their basic rights. Hence, the need to ask to what extent the international community is truly committed to the principles we all committed to uphold following the end of the Second World War. Madam President, from this rostrum and against this critical backdrop and the unprecedented challenges we are facing, we would like to call upon you once again to use this 80th anniversary as an opportunity to renew our commitment to uphold multilateralism and to support the United Nations in order to undertake its main mission, particularly with regards to maintaining international peace and security and supporting development efforts, promoting humanitarian action, and preserving human rights. This should be based on equity, justice, equality, non-discrimination in a way that would preserve the human dignity of all peoples without any exception or selectivity or double standards. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States of America.
Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, and esteemed colleagues, we are gathered today to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a conflict that left an estimated 60 million dead worldwide, countless wounded, displaced, or missing, with civilians comprising the majority. At this time, we remember the singular horror of the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were viciously murdered by the genocidal Nazi regime and its collaborators in one of the darkest periods of human history. We also remember the Roma and Sinti, peoples of Slavic and Polish ancestry, persons with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, Jehovah's Witnesses, persons targeted based on their sexual orientation, and countless other innocent victims. Madam President, we must renew our solemn vow to never again allow such atrocities to take place and declare that never again means now, as we confront the worst outbreak of anti-Semitism in generations. The memory of the Second World War must also be a time to honor the enormous sacrifices of the Allied forces against the Axis powers, including the service members of the United States military and all of the civilians who joined in the noble cause. The bravery and dignity of those who opposed and resisted those forces are the legacy of all subsequent generations throughout the world. We call upon all members of the international community to reflect upon and confront the lessons of that terrible war, honestly and without distortion. One of the lessons is this: tyranny and aggression will be met with resistance, and justice will prevail in the end. Madam President, after the end of World War II, the principles of sovereignty and political independence of states and the equal dignity of all individuals were enshrined in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to guard succeeding generations from the scourge of war. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, let us remember the importance of these principles as serving the basis upon which we must work together today to build a peaceful, prosperous, and just world for all. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a war which brought untold sorrow to humankind. This commemoration allows us to recall and reflect on the lessons of war and to truly appreciate the need and enduring importance of enhanced international cooperation, peace, and reconciliation amidst a rapidly changing world where mistrust and inequalities persist. Today, as in many parts of the world, we honor the millions of people who fought, sacrificed, and lost their lives in the Second World War. We pay tribute to our veterans, our brave soldiers, and all those who stood firm for freedom and for humanity. Our country and people also suffered gravely from the horrors of World War II. Manila, our capital, was the most devastated city in the Pacific, almost unrecognizable after 3 years of bombardment and fierce urban combat. We lost more than 100,000 Filipino civilian lives just for Manila's freedom, and there were many more. In the north of Manila, many of our brave soldiers perished as they marched more than 60 miles during the infamous Death March. From the ashes of World War II came hope and a determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The devastation of the war necessitated the birth of this august institution. We need to remain seized of the spirit of unity and shared purpose that became the foundation of the United Nations. As a country deeply familiar with the atrocities brought about by war between and among nations, the Philippines has always chosen the path of peace, and it will continue to do so through diplomacy, dialogue, and cooperation. As our President has stated, we will always make a stand and will always stand for what is right, and we will continue to work with partners and the international community in building bridges, forging solutions, preserving our global commons, and strengthening our common commitment to a region, a world governed by rules, not by might, where the rights of countries, large or small, are respected. In honor of the victims of World War II, we support and stand in solidarity with all efforts to advance global peace. We reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism, the UN Charter, and to being a responsible member of the international community to build a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world for the current and future generations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Philippines, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Madam President, this meeting convened at a time the marking 80th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations, served as a significant occasion, refreshing strong will of the humanity to prevent recurrence of the scourge of the Second World War, which brought untold suffering and misery to mankind, and to walk along the road of independent development and a peaceful environment. Delegation of DPRK takes this opportunity to express deep condolences to the tens of the millions of innocent people who lost their precious lives during Second World War, and other victims as well as their bereaved families. At the same time, we pay solemn homage to the world anti-fascist martyrs who sacrificed valuable lives in their fight against Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. The end of the Second World War was a historic victory of the humanity won by joint struggle of world anti-fascist democratic forces with the Soviet-led army in the lead. It shocked the imperialist system of the colonial rule to its foundation and laid basis for building new multipolar world. The victory of World War against fascism is also imbued with the blood of Korean people who made the sacrifice for defeat of Japanese imperialism in the Eastern battlefield. The great President Comrade Kim Il-sung, the founder of DPRK, organized and waged 20 years-long anti-Japanese blood-armed struggle, thus making immortal contribution to finally defeating the Japanese imperialism and hastening the victory of the world anti-fascist war. The exploits of the world anti-fascist democratic forces who devoted unsparingly their precious blood and lives to the sacred cause of defending global peace, security, justice, and conscience will be recorded forever in the history of the struggle of mankind for freedom and independence. End of the Second World War led to the creation of the condition for founding of the United Nations with multilateralism at its core and establishment of the system of international relations with the fundamental principles of sovereign equality, respect for sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs. However, today we are witnessing open moves to glorify or even revive the history of the fascism in different parts of the world, which arouse deep concern and vigilance of international community. In some European countries, dangerous attempts are becoming undisguised to destroy monuments to the Soviet army and heroize the Nazism. In particular, a Japanese authority are engaged in the plot for distortion of history while persistently denying their past history of the invasion. They are refusing to sincerely apologize and compensate for crime of colonial rule of the Japanese imperialism, but are preoccupied with pursuits of its ambition to become the military power. The reality testified that if worrisome attempts to negate the result of the Second World War continue to be left alone, we cannot defend fundamental spirit of the UN Charter to respect the sovereignty of all countries and nations with possibility of allowing fascism to revive. At this solemn forum to commemorate victims of the Second World War, the DPRK delegation extends full support and solidarity to the government people of Russia in their efforts to safeguard sovereignty and legitimate security interests against neo-Nazism. And in the name of the 1 million Korean people massacred and victims of 8.4 billion forcible drafting and 200,000 sexual slavery of Japanese army, we strongly urge Japan to fully acknowledge, sincerely apologize, and thoroughly compensate for its past crime, no later than this year, which marks 80th anniversary of its defeat. In conclusion, DPRK will in the future too fulfill its responsibility and role in firmly safeguarding peace and stability in Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, and the rest of the world, with view to ensuring tragedy of Second World War is not repeated again. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, the Second World War is the largest scale conflict and brutal conflict in the history of humankind. The significance and the tragedy of this global conflict have been so great for the peoples of my country that today, 80 years after these events, more than 90% of the residents of Belarus view the Second World War as one of the events of greatest significance in the history of our state. This is why we, with pride, co-sponsored a resolution on the conduct of a special meeting of a General Assembly dedicated to this. We thank all states for their support for this important commemorative initiative. After the Second World War, Belarus was recognized as the Republic of the Soviet Union that suffered the most greatly, the first to suffer the strike. The war and the Nazi occupation period wrought irrevocable damage to Belarus. Nazis and henchmen destroyed no fewer than 12,300 of our towns and villages. 288 towns were completely burned down together with their residents, and they were never revived after the war. 209 of 270 cities were destroyed. Preliminary estimates of the losses for Belarus by the Nazis and henchmen indicate losses of more than $2.4 trillion, and that does not take into account cultural items of cultural heritage that were brought out, as well as new evidence about the areas that were subject to devastation. We did not receive any just or commensurate compensation for the damage to our country, if we can even talk about the compensation. The people of Belarus during the Second World War endured this horrors, and 1 out of every 3 people died. In Belarus, fascists organized more than 570 death camps for the mass extermination of people, and they took adults and children for labor exploitation and slavery. More than 380,000 people were victimized in this way. There's documentation of no fewer than 187 major punitive operations against civilians in Belarus. The day-to-day raids over the course of 4 years, destroying Belarusians. The Nazis had no concern for age, no concern for gender. This was fascism in its most inhumane form and at the most horrific scale. The war did not shield any family in Belarus. And every Belarusian family has history and has items linked to these fateful events, including medals and death certificates. And this is why Victory Day is marked every year with a particular sadness. And we take great pride in the fact that Belarusians made an invaluable contribution to the defeat of Nazism. Nearly 1.5 million Belarusians, men and women, fought on the front within the Red Army and in partisan divisions. They steadfastly fought at the sacrifice of their lives for freedom. And this is why we particularly pay tribute to the veterans of the war, the living, those who saw the events and directly participated in them. We pay tribute to those who suffered as a result of the tragedy, and we pay tribute to their feat, and we thank them for the victory. In our country, we have a social support system established to help participants in the Second World War, which is constantly being fine-tuned. Last week, an updated law on veterans entered into force, which, with additional measures to provide support for veterans and victims of the war, including increases in pensions, free medical equipment and medical treatment, and social rehabilitation means, and we pay tribute to those who did not live to today, the heroism and the feats of Konstantin Zaslonov, Vera Kharozhe, Vasily Korje, and many others who will forever remain etched in our memories. Their memories are and names are reflected in the names of schools and roads, and we pay tribute to the victims of the Second World War as well as the victims of the Holocaust, drawing a parallel with the genocide of the Russian people. This is this includes memorial monuments and plaques and alleys and squares. Over the past 5 years, the government undertook a number of important steps to memorialize these people. Laws have been adopted on genocide of the Belarusian people, which are geared towards preventing rehabilitation of Nazism and attempts to falsify history, to counter neo-Nazi manifestations in modern-day Belarusian society. And an updated constitution was adopted, including provisions for the preservation of historical truth and the memory on the Great Patriotic War and the mass heroism of the people. In 2025, we are concluding our implementation of the 5-year government program to commemorate the memory of the victors over Nazism, to preserve the heritage of our people, and to help ensure implementation of international agreements as well as memorials. Clearly, preservation of historical memory is only possible if this memory is passed down through generations. The topics of the Second World War and victims are included in all school textbooks in our country. The new generation needs to remember the lessons of the past to prevent a recurrence of such tragedies in the future. Madam President, the Second World War was not just a fight of people against an existential threat. This was a triumph of allies, and the people pulled together and fought in the face of danger. The anti-Hitlerite coalition brought together countries with various political systems, cultural traditions, as well as worldviews for the sake of the advancement of a greater goal to save the world from evil. This solidarity, this ability to set aside differences for the common good should serve as a lesson for us today. Of course, in modern-day realities, this level of cooperation seems impossible. Today, when odd politicians and their supporters are attempting to whitewash Nazis and their henchmen, to rewrite history, to expunge the inconvenient country's feats, and to establish new divisive lines, we firmly, resolutely uphold preservation of historical memory, for the preservation of cooperation, for the memory of our predecessors. We need to abandon prejudice, abandon confrontation, seek ways to engage in dialogue and cooperation, to advance technological progress, trade, share experience, to help one another. This is the only way we can fulfill what is enshrined in the Charter of the UN, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to create a community genuinely of united nations. Thank you for your attention. I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus, says the President, and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. There are few nations in the world for whom the commemoration of the Second World War bears such a profound historical and emotional weight as it does for Poland. For us, this is not a symbolic exercise. It is a moment to confront painful memories, to pay our respect to those who suffered and resisted tyranny, and to reaffirm our responsibilities. Poland was the first victim of the Second World War. Attacked by Nazi Germany on September 1st, 1939, and then by the Soviet Union on September 17th of the same year. This came as a result of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, aimed at the partition of the Central Europe, including Poland, which was a clear breach of the fundamentals of international law. The two coordinated acts of aggression marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods of Polish history and started the war and suffering of all humankind. For Poland, the Second World War brought devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. Nearly 6 million of our citizens, around 17% of our pre-war population, were killed. It was the highest proportional loss of any country in Europe. Many of them were Polish Jews who lost their lives in the Holocaust. The victims included those who died in battle, but far more were civilians, women, children, and elderly, deliberately targeted, deported, starved, tortured, and murdered. They perished in the Nazi Germany extermination camps, in forced labor and mass executions, in Soviet gulags and persecutions, from which we particularly remember the Katyn massacre of the thousands of Polish military and police officers, border guards, and intelligentsia, prisoners of war. Countless victims suffer from the pseudo-medical experiments, sexual violence, forced resettlements, and the kidnapping of children. These were not incidental atrocities. They were systematic tools of terror committed on the occupied territories of Poland. It is our duty to ensure that they will never be forgotten. Polish government never collaborated with the occupants, nor did the Polish citizens had never give up their desire for freedom. To the contrary, brave Polish soldiers were fighting the aggressor all across the world, on the Eastern and Western Front, together with all our allied armies. Throughout war, Poles heroically stood up to violence and subjugations by joining uprisings, to name most notably the Warsaw Uprising and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Today, we pay tribute to their heroism. Madam President, thanks to this fight, Poland survived the war, but Polish citizens did not get the chance to choose their future freely. The end of the war in 1945 did not bring freedom neither to Poland nor to many Central and Eastern European countries. Instead, it brought another form of oppression, Soviet domination behind the Iron Curtain, marked by the economic exploitation, political persecution, torture, and relentless repressions. There is a very telling story associated with this. Polish representatives were not allowed to take part in the UN conference in San Francisco in 1945 because of the Soviet denial. A world-famous Polish pianist, Artur Rubinstein, who was performing during that event, saw the Polish flag was missing. He said, and I quote, "In this hall in San Francisco, where the great nations have gathered to make this world a better place, I don't see the flag of Poland, on behalf of which this cruel war was waged. And so now I play the Polish national anthem instead." And so he did. Madam President, we recall the crimes committed during the Second World War not to fuel hatred, but to uphold the truth. The truth is a foundation for justice and for peace. This historical experience shapes our deep and unwavering commitment to upholding the international law and the values enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. As a founding member of this organization, Poland remains determined, in the words of the Charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This determination is not a historical relic. Yet again, nowadays, the peace in Europe is overshadowed by the unprovoked brutal war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which is a proof that is a living imperative. Europe is being confronted with a war started by a regime seeking to redraw borders by force again. Once again, civilians, including children, are the principal victims. We must call this war what it is, and your imperial campaign of conquest, and we must respond with unity, resolve, and truth. Facing that and remembering the victims of the Second World War, Poland calls on all EU member states, UN member states, to stand by the principles which the organization was founded: the right of peoples to self-determination, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. We cannot allow any aggression to be normalized. Madam President, peace and reconciliation is essential, but they cannot be built on false equivalence or on forgetting. The Latin origin of the word reconciliare means to make good again, to restore what is broken. The restoration requires both accountability and reparations. It requires the courage to speak the truth and the will to ensure that those who commit war crimes are held responsible. Only then we honor the victims of the past, not just with words, but with actions. Only then we can fulfill the Charter's promise of peace, justice, and human dignity for all. Let us ensure that the sacrifices of those who perished in the Second World War were not in vain. Let us ensure that our generation, faced with its own tests, does not fail the cause of peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, President. Ukraine aligns with the statement delivered by the European Union. Today, we gather in the General Assembly Hall in solemn remembrance of all victims of the Second World War, one of the darkest chapters in human history. To our deepest regret, on Monday, this very GA hall was shamefully used by the Russian Federation for a so-called commemoration concert of victims of World War II, which in reality served as a vehicle for spreading Russian propaganda about the so-called Great Patriotic War. It resembled nothing more than a dance on the bones. And all this occurred at a time when the international community unites in paying tribute to the millions who gave their lives for peace, freedom, and dignity. This was a stark example of how the Russian Federation commemorates the victims of the Second World War, with a blatant moral disregard for tragedy. It glorifies a painful past and turns remembrance into a display of cynical celebration amid suffering and loss, serving ultimately as a tool for ideological manipulation and political propaganda. The memory of millions must not be defiled by tolerating the Soviet-Russian Great Patriotic Lie. This is about memory, not manipulation. It is about peace, not war. I must emphasize again, it was a disrespectful performance, a true dance on the bones, held in the very heart of the United Nations. President, 80 years ago, nations across the globe united to confront evil. At the staggering cost of tens of millions of lives, the war was brought to an end, and the foundations for lasting peace and international cooperation were laid. From that devastation, the vision of the United Nations emerged, first in the 1942 Declaration by the United Nations, and then with the founding of this organization. Ukraine was among the nations most devastated by World War II, suffering brutal oppression from the very outset, when totalitarian regimes in Berlin and Moscow jointly invaded Poland in 1939. We must never forget that the Soviet Union collaborated with Nazi Germany at the very start of the war. When that alliance collapsed in 1941, Ukraine bore the full weight of Nazi occupation, becoming a zone of terror, forced labor, and mass murder. And that oppression of Ukrainian people continued during Soviet times. The front swept across Ukraine's territory twice. At least 8 million Ukrainians died, 5 million civilians and 3 million soldiers. Among the victims on Ukrainian soil were 1.5 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, approximately a quarter of all European Jews killed during the Shoah. President, the contribution of every nation that fought against Nazism must be acknowledged. My country's role in defeating Nazism is undeniable. Over 6 million Ukrainians fought in the ranks of the Red Army, while hundreds of thousands more joined resistance movements and the armed forces of the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. This great victory and the peace and freedom for Europe were won with great Ukrainian sacrifice. That is why we categorically reject Moscow's cynicism in attempting to appropriate this historic achievement, to justify aggression against our state and against our people. We honor the memory of all those who fought and perished. Their sacrifice is an inseparable part of our national history and identity. We couple this tribute with an unequivocal condemnation of Nazism and all forms of totalitarianism. Fueled by hatred and propaganda, the Nazi regime inflicted genocide, aggression, and tyranny on an unimaginable scale. Today, we must be equally resolute in standing against any attempt to revive or justify such ideologies. Tragically, the solemn promise of never again remains unfulfilled. Since 1945, the world has witnessed new wars and atrocities. Today, Europe faces its most brutal war of aggression since the end of World War II. While attempting to monopolize the memory of victory over Nazism, the Russian Federation has since 2014 waged a full-scale war against Ukraine, committing the very crimes it once claimed to oppose. Just as the Nazis dehumanized their victims, Russia now dehumanizes Ukrainians under the false and cynical pretext of denazification. For over 3 years, Russia has carried out widespread atrocities, relentless missile strikes on residential areas and civilian infrastructure, executions of prisoners of war, systematic torture, and the forcible deportation of over 19,500 Ukrainian children, acts that meet the legal definition of genocide. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin in connection with these crimes. By weaponizing the language of anti-Nazism, Russia seeks to justify its own war crimes and crimes against humanity. As we commemorate the victims of the Second World War, Russian missiles and drones continue to strike Ukrainian homes, hospitals, schools, killing civilians, including children, elderly, persons with disabilities. We must collectively prevent all those who manipulate history, appropriate our collective victory, and justify aggression and crimes. President, on this day of remembrance, let us not only reflect on the past, but act with resolve in the present. The sacrifices made 80 years ago must not be betrayed. We call on all member states to strengthen their collective efforts to defend the UN Charter and ensure that justice, accountability, and lasting peace prevail in Ukraine and worldwide. Only through unity and unwavering support for those under attack can we truly honor the memory of all victims of Second World War and ensure that the promise never again becomes our reality. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Today, we remember the enormous contributions and sacrifices made and honor the lives lost in pursuit of peace and security 80 years ago. Allied forces, united in their mission to liberate Europe from Nazi oppression, were victorious. But we must never forget the tragic human cost of the Second World War. Over 70 million lives lost around the world. And as the world wars begin to fade from living memory, we must ensure the stories of those who lived through and fought in them are remembered by generations to come. This organization was founded in the wake of conflict to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, underpinned by a charter which united the world with the aim of maintaining international peace and security, reaffirming our shared faith in human rights, and promoting development. The United Kingdom remains deeply committed to those principles and to the UN Charter. In the UN's 80th year, our shared mission is more important than ever. The world faces the highest number of conflicts globally since the UN's inception. The human costs are rising. In Europe, security is once again threatened by blatant disrespect for the principles of sovereign equality of states and respect for territorial integrity. These principles matter for all states. President, my grandfather served as a British Army officer in France and in Italy during the Second World War. And decades later, even at the height of the Cold War, he spoke warmly of the Soviet forces he had fought alongside to defeat fascism. Russia's claims that the Ukrainian government is akin to the regime of German Nazis is false and malicious propaganda that insults the memory of the Soviet forces who fought and died during the Second World War. We were called here today for one solemn purpose: to commemorate the victims of the Second World War. The fact that Russia sees fit to use this meeting to peddle blatant disinformation is shameful, but it will not distract us. As my Prime Minister said, this is a time to celebrate hard-won peace, honor the memory of those who lost their lives, and remember the sacrifices made by so many to secure our freedom. The United Kingdom will continue to pay tribute to the victims of war by pressing for a just and lasting peace in response to conflicts around the world. As we join together today, we encourage all member states to consider this anniversary a stark reminder that peace cannot be taken for granted. We must all redouble our efforts to bring about the peace and security the people of the world need and which they deserve. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Madam Chair, at the outset, I would like to join the previous speakers in emphasizing the importance of this solemn meeting of the General Assembly. Today we come together to remember one of the most tragic and defining chapters in history, the Second World War, and to honor the immense sacrifices made in the name of peace, freedom, and human dignity. The Second World War brought untold sorrow to humankind. Its scale, devastation, and loss of life were unprecedented. Tens of millions perished, entire cities were reduced to ruins, and generations were marked by grief. The horrors of the war and the memory of its countless victims must never be forgotten. This commemoration offers us a profound opportunity to reflect on our shared past. It reminds us of the resilience of humanity, the dangers of division and hatred, and the enduring importance of unity in the face of existential threats. It is a moment to pay tribute to those who gave their lives and to recognize the nations and peoples whose courage shaped the victory over fascism. Madam Chair, the Second World War touched every continent and every nation, and my country, Azerbaijan, was no exception. The war left its mark on every Azerbaijani family. Nearly 700,000 of our sons and daughters were mobilized to the front. Out of 3.4 million of the total population of Azerbaijan at the time, more than 350,000 made the ultimate sacrifice. Madam Chair, the victory was achieved not only on the battlefield, but also through the unbreakable will and dedication of the home front. Azerbaijan played a pivotal role in supplying the wartime economy. The oil workers in our capital, Baku, toiled day and night, producing over 80% of the crude oil and 96% of lubricants used by the army. More than 130 types of military equipment, armaments, and ammunition were manufactured in Azerbaijan during the war. Our people also opened their homes and hearts to those in need and provided vital humanitarian support. 41 military hospitals operated in Baku alone, where over 440,000 wounded soldiers received medical care. Madam Chair, this desire to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war led to the establishment of the United Nations and the development of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The creation of multinational judicial institutions to prosecute and punish war crimes underscored the potential of justice when backed by political will. The lessons of the Second World War continue to shape our world today, particularly as tensions arise, old conflicts resurface, or new ones emerge, and international law and customs are eroded. If international law and the rule of law are to mean anything, and it is indeed so, judging at least by statements and discussions that the walls in this very building hear almost daily, then selectivity and double standards must have no place in matters relating to the maintenance of peace and security, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and the promotion of human rights and justice. As we commemorate this anniversary and all victims, we must reaffirm our commitment to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and strengthen our resolve to prevent and settle conflicts, end impunity for serious offenses, confront disinformation, foster cooperation, and build a future grounded in peace, justice, and mutual respect. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Azerbaijan for that statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
President, China welcomes the convening of this special meeting by the General Assembly on the 80th anniversary of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. We deeply mourn the innocent victims of the war and pay our highest tribute to the heroes who dedicated their precious lives to the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War and to the cause of peace, civilization, and progress for all humanity. 80 years ago, the people of the world, through bloody and arduous struggles, completely defeated fascism, achieving a monumental victory where justice triumphed over evil, light over darkness, and the progressive over the reactionary. As the primary Eastern theater of the war, China endured enormous casualties exceeding 35 million. By holding back the main forces of Japanese militarism, China not only secured its own survival and national salvation, but also provided strong support to the resistance forces in Europe and the Pacific, making an indelible contribution to the victory of the world anti-fascist war. President, the victory of World War II ushered in a new era of peace and development. 80 years later, the world has entered a new period of turbulence and change, with unilateralism on the rise and bullying running rampant. We must seize the opportunity presented by the 80th anniversary of the victory of World War II to learn from history, reaffirm our original aspirations and commitments, shoulder the responsibilities of our time, and forge a bright future. First, we must jointly promote a correct understanding of the history of World War II. Remembering history is not to perpetrate hatred, but to better cherish the present and shape the future. Only with a correct understanding of history can we fulfill the noble ideal enshrined in the UN Charter, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, end of quote. Any scheme or action seeking to downplay, deny, or distort the history of World War II, and any rhetoric that glorifies wars of aggression and colonial rule, tantamount to a mockery of history and an affront to human conscience, and will surely forfeit the trust of the global community. Second, we must jointly safeguard the victory of World War II. In the aftermath of its immense catastrophe, the international community joined hands to establish the United Nations and formulate the UN Charter, laying the cornerstone of the modern international order and establishing the fundamental principles of contemporary international relations. Concepts such as sovereign equality, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of disputes have gradually taken root in the hearts of the people. We must firmly uphold the UN-centered international system, the international order based on international law, and the rules-based multilateral trading system, and unequivocally say no to all forms of power politics and bullying. Third, we must jointly uphold the authority and status of the United Nations. The United Nations has been instrumental in maintaining world peace and promoting common development. That said, the UN needs to keep pace with the times through continuous reform and improvement. The more volatile the global landscape, the greater the need for international solidarity to support the UN's central role in international affairs. Certain countries treat the UN as something they can use when it suits them and discard when it doesn't. They willfully withdraw from agreements and organizations in succession, default on contribution payments, and cut funding in an attempt to place their narrow interests over the collective global good. Such practices are deeply unpopular and are ultimately doomed to failure. President, history may have its twists and turns, but it always moves forward. Carrying on the torch, defending peace, and staying on the right course is the best tribute to those who have fallen for our cause. China stands ready to work with all member states to practice genuine multilateralism, cement the foundation of world peace and development, and jointly build a community with a shared future for humanity. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Today, we honor the memory of the millions who perished in the Second World War, a cataclysm that reshaped humanity's consciousness. From its ashes, the United Nations was born, entrusted with the mission to ensure peace, prevent global conflict, and protect future generations. As we mark the 80th anniversary of both the war and the founding of this organization, we reflect on the enduring lessons of that tragedy, the consequences of unchecked aggression, ideological extremism, and disunity among nations. These lessons call on us to choose dialogue over conflict, cooperation over isolation, and development over destruction. Peace demands an unwavering commitment to resolve disputes through peaceful means and diplomacy. For Kazakhstan, this day carries profound significance. Over 1.2 million Kazakh sons and daughters, other nationalities, fought in the war, have never returned. Our nation endured immense sacrifice. No family was untouched. Our home front endured unimaginable hardships. Factories fueled the Allied effort, and our people, not having enough food themselves, sheltered over 1 million refugees, sharing the last they had. Every 9 of 10 bullets produced were made here. Kazakhstan became a symbol of resilience, unity, and solidarity. Today, Kazakhstan stands not only as a land of sacrifice, but as a champion of peace. We renounced the world's fourth largest nuclear arsenal, established the nuclear weapon-free zone in Central Asia, and promote multilateralism through initiatives like the Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions. Excellencies, 8 decades later, the victims we honor compel us to strengthen the UN, reject force in international affairs, and uphold dignity, justice, and cooperation. Peace is more than the absence of war. It is political stability, economic development, and multifaceted cooperation. As the Kazakh saying goes, a tree with strong roots withstand the storm. So let the lessons of history be our roots. Let our commitment to peace be the legacy we uphold. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia.
Madam Chair, today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the darkest chapter of the history of mankind, we gather in solemn gratitude to honor the heroes, men and women alike, whose courage, sacrifice, and sense of duty shaped the course of the history. We also commemorate the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and its charter that laid foundation of the global order anchored on the international law. It is our moral duty to remember and pay tribute to all those bore unimaginable losses and dignity and resolve. Their lasting legacy is the freedom we enjoy and the liberties we cherish. The Armenian people paid a heavy price in this victory. Nearly 600,000 Armenians took part in the war. More than half never returned. Among them were the 4 marshals, an admiral of the fleet, 60 generals. Thousands of our diaspora compatriots served valiantly in the Allied forces worldwide. The legendary resistance fighter Misak Manouchian, now laid to rest in France's Pantheon, stands as a powerful symbol of this sacrifice. We also pay tribute to the writers among the nations, including Armenians who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, keeping the flame of humanity alive in its darkest hour. Madam President, 8 Decades later, the international community continues to face of growing volume and severity of the conflicts. Utter disregard of the international law, destabilizing military buildup, gross violations of human rights, racism, xenophobia, and hate on ethnic and religious grounds. We resolutely condemn manifestation of anti-Armenian hatred in the region, including the deliberate destruction and desecration of monuments, memorials, museums dedicated to the contribution of the Armenian people to the victory in the Second World War. In light of those challenges, we stand at the pivotal moment in the history where the determination of international community to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war requires renewed global resolve. The international community should resolutely respond to the use of force as means for conflict resolution. It is through commitment to the principles of the peaceful resolution of disputes and upholding of the human rights for all that the UN member states can collectively address the emerging threats to peace and security. Madam President, I would like to reiterate Armenia's strong determination to contribute to the efforts aimed at strengthening the multilateral system based on the international law and shared values of freedom, justice, and human rights. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Armenia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Madam President, Excellencies, it is symbolic that we gather here today in this distinguished Hall of Nations to remember and honor the victims of World War II. This is not only a commemoration of the past, it is a warning to the present, and it must be a call to action for the future. Too often, the story of the Holocaust is told from the moment the gates of Auschwitz opened, but that is not where it began. The Holocaust did not start in the gas chambers. It did not begin with ghettos or deportation trains. No, it began with words, with lies, with a slow, steady normalization of Jew hatred. It was not gas chambers that laid the foundation of the Holocaust. It was ideology. It was centuries of anti-Semitism, repackaged by the Nazi regime into a campaign of extermination. Long before there were concentration camps, there were insults. Before Kristallnacht, there were libels. Before the 6 million were murdered, they were dehumanized. The ground was fertile. The hatred was ancient. The world had seen it before, but it looked away. And that is what we must not do again. Colleagues, the Jewish people have not forgotten. We carry the memory of the Holocaust in our bones, in our blood, in our families. As Israel's ambassador, I stand here to speak not only for the memory of the 6 million, but for the mission they passed on to us, to ensure that what happened once will never happen again. But I must say that hate is again gaining momentum. Today, in 2025, we are witnessing an explosion of anti-Semitism that is impossible to ignore and harder still to bear. Synagogues are attacked. Jewish students are hunted across campuses. Social media is flooded with blood libels. Swastikas are spray-painted on playgrounds. Jewish people are being told that their very identity is cause for shame. In the wake of October 7, Jews were once again slaughtered in their homes. Babies, mothers, entire families. We saw not universal condemnation. but justification. We saw not global solidarity, but silence, or worse, even celebration. What are we to make of a world that claims to remember the Holocaust, but refuses to recognize anti-Semitism today? Have we learned nothing? When terrorists film their massacres, parade dead kidnapped children through the streets, and then call it resistance, and the world justifies it, what lesson from World War II was truly learned? When Jewish grief is questioned, when Jewish trauma is dismissed, when Jewish life is treated as negotiable, what has remembrance really achieved? When the world allows Jewish hatred to fester, Jews are murdered. That is fact. That is history. That is why we cannot separate remembrance from responsibility. That is why I urge all member states to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. As a nation born from the ashes of the Holocaust, a nation our murdered grandparents could only dream of, we do not take this task lightly. We will continue to educate. We will continue to speak the truth. We will call out anti-Semitism, even when it comes dressed in the language of human rights. Because anti-Semitism has evolved. It no longer always wears a swastika. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it waves a flag. And too often, it is granted a platform, even in this very institution, even in this very hall. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of Holocaust denial. Its leaders have not only questioned the Holocaust, but openly mocked the victims. While denying the murder of 6 million Jews, they dream of doing it again. Iran's supreme leader has repeatedly and proudly called for the destruction of the state of Israel, home to over 7 million Jews. They are not alone. Iran has outsourced this genocidal agenda to its terrorist proxies. They are instruments of Iran's Sikh mission, a mission inherited from the Nazis to wipe Jewish people from the earth, and that is a member state of the United Nations. Look at the Houthis in Yemen. From hundreds of kilometers away, they fire ballistic missiles at Israeli population centers simply out of hatred of Jews. We have no border with them. We have no conflict with them. Pure hate. But unlike in the Holocaust, the Jewish people are no longer defenseless. Today, we can rise and strike back. We will do whatever we deem necessary to prevent a second Holocaust, whatever it takes. That is why this commemoration matters, because we need more courage to confront the evil that remains, hoping to drag us backwards. Today, as we remember the victims of World War II, let us remember all of them, the soldiers who fought evil, the civilians caught in the crossfire, the nations that paid the price, and the Jewish people who bore the worst of humanity's failure to stand up in time. If the UN is to honor the legacy of World War II, it cannot do it selectively. It must confront anti-Semitism wherever it arises. It must call out in every forum, every resolution, every gathering. It must stand with the Jewish people, not only when it's easy, but when it is hard. Many here and many around the world proclaim, never again. Now is the time for that proclamation to finally become action. Let it be our policy. Let it be the promise that this time the world will not be silent. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me first to thank for convening this special solemn meeting of General Assembly, as this year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I would like to pay my deepest tribute to all the victims of the war who made a great sacrifice to mankind. On this somber occasion, I recall the United Nations was established 8 years ago in order to, quote, save unsucceeding generation from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and end of the quote, as the preamble of the Charter states. It also stipulates that this body is built to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and human dignity, establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Based on this founding philosophy, the United Nations and its member states have made relentless efforts, allowing the institution to play an indispensable role in maintaining international peace and security, as well as promoting respect for international law. Madam President, yet as we turn our eyes onto the world today, division and confrontations continue to exist. While more crises are erupting in various parts of the world, conflicts, hunger, and humanitarian crises profoundly threaten human dignity of every person. Faced with these significant challenges, member states gathered at the Summit of the Future in September last year. I commend the adoption of the Pact for the Future, aiming to protect the needs and interests of present and future generations. The Pact covers a broad range of issues, including human dignity and rule of law, among others, and pledged a new beginning of multilateralism, with the United Nations playing a central role. For the UN to respond effectively to challenges of our time, the body needs to reform itself, including the Security Council. In that endeavor, the importance of unity of the international community cannot be overstated, especially as we celebrate the UN's 80th anniversary of its founding this year. Madam President, reflecting upon the past 8 decades, Japan has walked the path of peace-loving nation. The current administration has upheld in its entirety the positions of the previous cabinets on history, including their prime minister's statements, and will continue to do so. Today, freedom, democracy, and fundamental human rights are unshakable foundations of every decision and action that Japan takes. Consequently, Japan has made serious efforts to promote the rule of law. Concurrently, Japan has made serious efforts to promote the rule of law in international society, stressing the importance of full compliance with international law, including the UN Charter. We are proud of our endeavor as part of collective global efforts toward international peace and prosperity, and will spare no effort to carry on. Looking towards the future, Japan will continue to work hand in hand with the international community and the UN to tackle today's mounting challenges. To realize a world without nuclear weapons, Japan has steadily advanced efforts towards nuclear disarmament. This year marks the 80th year since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Foreign Minister Iwaya Takeshi attended and actively contributed to the third session of the Preparatory Committee for the 2026 Review Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is currently taking place in New York. Also taking on global issues such as climate change, global health, development, and disaster risk reduction, Japan will accelerate its efforts to meet Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 based on the concept of human security. We will continue to promote human rights and gender equality, including the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, as well as humanitarian assistance and peace building. In closing, I cannot overstate the importance of efforts to unite UN's critical role in addressing these challenges that people around the world are confronted with. Today, Japan reaffirms its unwavering commitment to making every effort to contribute to this end as a responsible member state of this unparalleled institution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. Lithuania aligns with the statement of the European Union. I also make a statement in my national capacity. Today, we pay tribute to those who perished and suffered during the horrors of the Second World War. We remember tens of millions who died, majority among them innocent civilians, also many wounded, displaced, missing. We honor and mourn of all mercilessly killed and tortured in the Holocaust, in the persecution of targeted population groups and individuals. This tremendous loss will never be recovered. The Second World War caused enormous trauma that is and will be felt for generations. The tragedy of the 20th century that should never be forgotten. Moreover, it should never be repeated. Lithuania, like so many European nations during the Second World War, have suffered the calamity of foreign occupations. We were prey of both the Nazi and Soviet onslaught, unleashing the bloodshed, losses, and pain to our communities. Under the most difficult times of occupations, the nation never lost hope and strived to restore our state. We fought for our dream. On February 16, 1949, the 7 commanders of all military formations of Lithuania's anti-Soviet resistance have signed a declaration expressing the nation's will to re-establish democratic, independent Lithuania. They supported the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and called for its applicability to Lithuania. They carved Lithuania's desire to join the United Nations and ongoing European integration process. And their voices have never been heard at this UN General Assembly hall. The Iron Curtain has split the continent. Outnumbered and outgunned, they died ambushed in the battlefields, or when betrayed and taken alive, tortured and executed by NKVD or KGB in Moscow or Vilnius prisons. Out of 7 signatories, only 1 had military rank. Others were teachers, students, and accountants. We Lithuanians owe them our resilience to withstand the totalitarian regimes. The World War II for us ended in the 1990s when independence from the occupying Soviet rule was restored and when the last Soviet soldier left our territory. Mr. President, after being admitted to the United Nations in 1991, Lithuania have joined the democratic transatlantic and European alliances. We continue working with all the peace-loving nations to build a better, peaceful world based on international law, human rights, and sovereign equality of states. Regrettably today, we must also recognize that our aspirations for the future are being brutally challenged. Russia's continued unprovoked military aggression against Ukraine targets and destroys Ukrainian cities and murders civilians. It is being done in pursuit of the neo-colonial legacy of the Soviet Union, brutally violating the UN Charter and international law. Just as communism crushed entire nations under the pretense of liberty, Russia now falsely claims the fighting neo-Nazism while waging a cruel war of conquest against Ukraine. It instrumentalizes the memory of the Second World War to justify its former and current crimes, avoiding accountability. Glorifying the Soviet Union's role in war, it tends to conveniently obscure the fact that it was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, its secret protocols signed between the Soviet and Nazi foreign ministers on behalf of Hitler and Stalin that illegally divided Europe, including Baltic states, among themselves. And that was the final step towards World War II. Now, like in 1939, we again hear a blatant Russia's demand that half of Europe returns to its sphere of influence. Madam President, we should not allow selective remembrance to distort the past and justify present aggressive behavior. We regret that Putin's regime has stifled Russia's own community of credible voices, historians from Memorial and other civil society organizations. They have worked diligently in archives and with society to establish the facts and to present the names and the fate of the victims of the repressions of the last century. In 2009, European Parliament has issued a call in defense of Memorial and its work. This suppression of trusted and honest voices only delays the freeing Russia's society from the narratives adapted from the totalitarian handbook. Till this happens, it is the responsibility of all peace-loving members of the international community to defend human rights, the international law, and the UN Charter, the principles of equality and sovereignty of states, the integrity to reject war and aggression, and to pursue peaceful coexistence of all. This is our duty in the memory of all victims of Second World War. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Excellency, уважаемые коллеги.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, today we speak in our capacity as not as victors, but as the guardians of memory. 80 years have elapsed since the end of the most devastating war in the history of humankind, the conflict which claimed tens of millions of lives, which devastated cities, which destroyed generations and severed the history of families. The Second World War was not merely a military conflict. This became a moral moment in civilization and a time when humankind found itself at the verge of self-destruction. The magnitude of this tragedy was a potent blow to human conscience, and the peoples of the world determined never again to allow a repetition of this evil. The result of this decision was the establishment of the United Nations, a system that is rooted in agreements, peace, solidarity, and collective security. In addition to the military victory over fascism, the establishment of the United Nations became a key civilizational step. And this is precisely why Serbia, a country that incurred tremendous human losses in the fight against Nazism and fascism, we perceive a profound moral duty to participate in this solemn meeting. Our history reminds us not just of what transpired, but this is also a warning and an indication and a guide to us about what kind of people we wish to be. History shows that the world cannot be preserved in a passive way. This peace cannot be preserved in a passive way. Peace is based on responsibility. And today, 80 years later, we commemorate this moment, not just as a reminder, but anniversary of the end of the war. We should like this commemoration not just to remain left in the archives, but this rather to prompt people towards collective action, for places where people suffered not to be forgotten, for the crimes not to be downplayed, for the heroes not to be placed on equal footing with the executioners, for the truth to remain the criteria and not a subject to political interpretations. We are gathered here today not to talk about the past, but in order to preserve the future. War begins not with a shot, but rather with a forgetfulness. And world begins not with a signature, but with responsibility. And if we lose our ability to remember, then we will lose our ability to empathize. And without empathy, the world will no longer be a community of nations and will become a market of interest. On behalf of the Republic of Serbia and our citizens, on behalf of the innocent victims, on behalf and in the name of peace, which we owe our children, thank you very much for this moment today. I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, states the president, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señora Presidente.
Madam President, on the 7th of May, 1945, as dawn broke over an exhausted Europe, the surrender was signed in Reims, marking the beginning of the end of the most devastating conflagration humanity has ever known. That day, not only did a war end, a dark chapter of civilization closed, and amid smoking ruins and broken souls, a window of hope to reinvent the world was opened. If that window of hope opened in Europe in 1945, we must remember that the war would continue to bleed the Pacific for 3 more months, culminating in that incinerated August of that year when humankind crossed the irreversible threshold into the atomic age, Today we gather under the weight of memory to honor the 75 million lives cut short during those 6 years, a chilling mosaic of interrupted dreams that represented at that time 3% of the entire world's population. Every number, every statistic hides a universe of personal stories. The children who never reached adulthood, the promises of youth that the conflict unraveled, the families that grief scattered like leaves in the wind, and the elderly who saw the archives of their memories burn. And this macabre accounting doesn't even begin to measure the transgenerational trauma that, like a silent shockwave, continues to reverberate in the DNA of families and entire peoples. At this critical moment, when once again the shadows of war cast their darkness over 3 continents, allow me, Madam President, to articulate 3 thoughts to understand our present in the light of that past. First, we must recognize that true peace is not built solely on the silence of weapons, but through the constant presence of fair institutions and cooperative solidarity. The United Nations was born then not only as a covenant between states, but also as a solemn promise to the dead that their sacrifice would not be in vain. That promise, renewed every day in this chamber, has saved countless lives from hunger, war, and hopelessness. However, the architecture of collective security we have built today resembles a cathedral with threatened foundations and pillars that tremble before new storms. In 2024, global military spending reached its highest level in history, exceeding $2.7 trillion, according to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Redirecting a fraction of global military spending would be enough to change the destiny of humanity, to halt climate collapse, eradicate extreme poverty, and ensure basic education for every child on the planet. This is not a utopia. It is a matter of political will. Secondly, Costa Rica reiterates its unwavering commitment to general and complete nuclear disarmament. When we remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we commemorate not only the end of a war, but the beginning of an era in which humanity acquired the power to extinguish itself. Almost 8 decades ago, the first resolution adopted by this General Assembly established a commission to study the problems arising from the discovery of atomic energy and formulated proposals to eliminate atomic weapons from national armaments. This founding aspiration of the United Nations remains a historic, unfinished business. In this context, Costa Rica urges the nuclear weapons states to comply with Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This call cannot be considered in isolation from recent progress in this area. We also urge you to recognize that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons strengthens and complements the NPT. It represents a decisive step towards compliance with that original resolution, and an essential element of the non-proliferation regime. Nuclear deterrence, far from guaranteeing security, has created a balance of terror whose long-term sustainability is ethically unacceptable. Third, we must honor the legal and moral legacy that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War brought about a fundamental transformation in international relations with the establishment of the United Nations system and the establishment of the international rule of law. This historic achievement was crystallized in crucial instruments such as the UN Charter and the creation of the International Court of Justice, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Geneva Conventions, and subsequently the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, among others. More than a simple codification of principles, these instruments shaped a new multilateral legal paradigm, cemented in shared universal values. This normative edifice represented an unprecedented global consensus that lasting peace can only be built on the foundations of social justice, equitable development, and unrestricted respect for human dignity. History has shown that where this normative order is weakened, or where systematic discrimination, extreme inequality, and exclusion prevail, the seeds of new conflicts are inevitably sown. Madam President, peace is not the end of a conflict, nor the spoils of the strongest. Peace is practiced, cultivated, and defended. May this 80th anniversary not only be an exercise in remembrance, but a renewed pact among all states present here to reimagine security as cooperative solidarity, to work tirelessly for a world free of nuclear weapons, and for an international order where law prevails over might and where we understand peace as a shared endeavor. And may the memory of those who perished in the Second World War not be trapped in stone monuments, but rather mobilize us to the concrete and transformative action that our time demands and humankind deserves. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
Thank you for convening this meeting and for giving me the floor. Madam President, the memory of the Second World War remains a stark and indelible scar on human history. The sheer scale of suffering, the millions of lives lost, the widespread devastation, and the profound societal upheaval serve as a potent reminder of the catastrophic consequences of unchecked aggression and ideological extremism. Remember the victims of this global conflict is not merely an act of historical acknowledgement, but a crucial exercise in extracting vital lessons and formulating future recommendations to achieve lasting peace and development for all humanity. Madam President, one of the most profound lessons gleaned from the Second World War is the utter fragility of human civilization and the absolute necessity of maintaining peace and stability. The conflict shattered economies, decimated infrastructure, and displaced populations of an unprecedented scale, setting back development efforts by decades in many regions, including in my country. The immense human cost, measured in lives lost, families torn apart, and the long-lasting psychological trauma, underscores the fundamental truth that sustained development and economic growth are impossible in the face of widespread violence and insecurity. The memory of the victims compels us to prioritize diplomatic solutions, strengthen international institutions, and actively work to prevent future conflicts through dialogue, cooperation, reconciliation, and addressing the root causes such as poverty, inequality, and injustice. The Second World War also highlighted the critical importance of international cooperation and multilateralism. The eventual defeat of the Axis powers was a testament to the power of nations uniting against a common threat. The subsequent establishment of the United Nations and other international organizations reflected a collective understanding that global challenges require global solutions. Madam President, the lessons learned from this era underscores the need to foster strong international partnerships, promote free and fair trade, and work collaboratively to address shared issues such as pandemics, climate change, and economic instability. Sustainable development and inclusive economic growth in an interconnected world demand a commitment to multilateralism and a rejection of isolationist or unilateral approaches. The aftermath of the Second World War also demonstrated the power of investing in human capital and rebuilding societies. The Marshall Plan and similar initiatives, while not without their complexities, illustrate the potential for economic recovery and growth through strategic investment in infrastructure, education, and social welfare. Moreover, the Second World War served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked nationalism, xenophobia, and the dehumanization of others. The ideologies that fueled the conflict led to unimaginable atrocities and systematic persecution of entire groups of people. Madam President, remember the victims necessitates a continued commitment to promoting tolerance, understanding, and respect for diversity. Education plays a crucial role in fostering empathy and critical thinking, helping to dismantle prejudice and build inclusive societies where all individuals can contribute to and benefit from economic growth and development. The memory of the Second World War and its countless victims, from the Holocaust to the victims of our days, offers profound and enduring lessons for our pursuit of human development and economic growth. It underscores the importance of peace and stability, the necessity of international cooperation and the power of investing in human capital, and the critical need to combat intolerance and promote inclusivity. By diligently remembering the past, we can draw vital future recommendations that prioritize peaceful conflict resolution, strengthen multilateral institutions, champion human development, and foster inclusive societies. Only by learning from the devastating consequences of this global conflict can we hope to build a future where development and economic growth are sustainable and equitable and contribute to the lasting well-being of all humanity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
President, almost 90 years ago, Ethiopia stood before the world and appealed to the then League of Nations for assistance from the destruction which had been unleashed against our country. At the time, Ethiopia stated the clear and imminent danger of the war and declared it was not the covenant of the League that was at stake, but global morality itself. Ethiopia then warned that actions of the League were little use if the will to keep them was lacking. History attested to the accuracy of our warning. The Second World War is a stark reminder of the horrific manifestation of what destruction of that magnitude could do to humanity and human civilization. It was a war that claimed the lives of many millions and brought the world to an almost annihilation. Many millions had fallen defending humanity and freedom. As we all know, it is this devastation that led to the birth of the United Nations, in which member states said never again, and pledged to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Despite the various challenges it has faced over the years, since its establishment, the United Nations remains instrumental in keeping that promise and strides forward to maintain international peace and security. It is in this global body that the principle of collective security is enshrined. With the Charter of United Nations states the noblest aspirations of humankind. The world has changed immensely since the end of the Second World War. The multifaceted challenges we face today are quite different from those that the founders of the United Nations had to grapple with in the aftermaths of the war. It should nevertheless be our collective responsibility to continue the efforts of maintaining peace and achieving sustainable development. We cannot afford to spare time nor efforts. We need to further strengthen global cooperation and forge stronger partnership. In realizing this critical objective, we need to continue in our endeavor to reinvigorate multilateralism with the aim of making the United Nations fit for purpose. We must also be vigilant to finish what we have started to ensure sustainable peace. Still, our multilateralism framework has failed to ensure equal representation of states, particularly in reference to the composition of the UN Security Council, in which Africa still lacks permanent representation. It is also critical that we scale up our efforts in peacekeeping activities. The world cannot afford to witness any relapse in the hard-fought gains achieved through the deployment of various peacekeeping missions. It is therefore remains essential that the necessary political and financial support be provided to peace operations to enable them to fulfill their mandates effectively. In conclusion, President, as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, my delegation would like to reiterate Ethiopia's commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations, as well as to continuing its efforts in realizing the noble objectives of the organization. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, 80 years ago, the deadliest war in human history came to its final days after inflicting unimaginable suffering on hundreds of millions across the globe. Today, my delegation joins others in solemnly commemorating the end of the Second World War. We honor the immense sacrifices made by countless individuals and pay tribute to all victims of the war. We remain forever indebted to all who fought and fell in Europe, Asia, Africa, to the Allied forces, and not least to the peoples of the former Soviet Union. Their courage and sacrifice not only helped save humanity from the tyranny, violence, and genocide of fascism, but also paved the way for the liberation of many peoples around the world from the shackles of colonialism and imperialism. The end of World War II holds profound and enduring meaning for peoples worldwide, for the United Nations, and for my own country, Vietnam. Amid the global upheaval of 1945, the Vietnamese people launched the August Revolution, ending nearly a century of colonial and later fascist domination, and marking Vietnam's historic transformation from a semi-feudal colony into an independent and democratic nation. It was a powerful testament to the unyielding spirit of a people steadfast in their pursuit of independence, freedom, and a brighter future. In many ways, the Allied victory in World War II served as a crucial catalyst for the birth of the nation of Vietnam in the modern era. Regrettably, the end of the war did not guarantee lasting peace. Our people continued to struggle and endure decades of devastating conflict before ultimately achieving unification and peace in 1975, exactly 30 years after World War II has ended. Madam President, the defeat of fascist and aggressor forces in the Second World War and in all wars and conflicts underscores a timeless truth. No force can prevail over the enduring aspiration for peace and the universal values of freedom and self-determination. In the aftermath of the war, the United Nations was born out of the shared resolve of the international community to live in peace and stability. Nations came together to establish a collective security system anchored in the UN Charter and the international law. The Charter's core principles, sovereign equality, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force, and especially the peaceful settlement of disputes, have been instrumental in averting another global war. As we reflect on one of the darkest chapters in the world history, today's commemoration serves as a stark reminder of the immense destruction wrought by wars, the precious gift of peace, and of our collective duty to prevent such tragedies from ever recurring. At a time when the world continues to face growing security challenges and intensifying great power competition, safeguarding peace demands renewed multilateralism and principled joint actions. Vietnam strongly believes that upholding international law, strengthening global solidarity, and fostering mutual trust and cooperation are essential to preserving the hard-won peace and stability we enjoy today. Vietnam's own turbulent history has taught us to never take peace for granted. And as a responsible and reliable member of the United Nations, Vietnam has spared no effort in advancing peace, security, and development, not only for our own nation, but also for the broader international community. Let me, Madam President, by reaffirming Vietnam's commitment to working with all partners to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world for future generations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Togo.
Thank you, Madam President. 8 decades ago, we saw one of the deadliest conflicts in history end. A conflict that saw the deaths of tens of millions of people, and my delegation would like to pay tribute to their memory here today. This conflict saw the totalitarian ambitions of some opposed to the desires for freedom of many others. And this led to many countless people losing their lives. They made the supreme sacrifice in the name of peace. History remembers the commitments and sacrifice of African riflemen whose efforts in the war was critical in defeating the totalitarian forces that were seeking to impose their domination upon the world. The sacrifice of all victims, resistance or civilians, who we are marking today, was not in vain. They died in order for a new world and a peaceful world to emerge, a world built on dialogue and on sharing a culture of peace, which is solidly anchored in our lives. Madam President, the post-Second World War world has led to major changes including in the reconfiguration of international relations, anchored on multilateralism. This led and was built on the establishment of the United Nations and the UN system, whose goal is to maintain international peace and security. As concerns Africa, the end of the conflict led to the acceleration of the struggle for decolonization, which, with the support of the United Nations, led to many territories achieving sovereignty and ultimately joining the Concert of Nations, breathing further life into multilateralism. The establishment of the UN in the wake of the Second World War also proceeds from this deep aspiration to move on from war and to open the door for peace by promoting multilateralism. And I would like to take this opportunity provided by this meeting to commend the engagement of the Secretary-General for peace throughout the world. But in spite of the work that the UN has done, we can see that the world remains plagued by conflicts, conflicts that only seem to be getting worse as the years pass and as the challenges become even more complex. For the delegation of Togo, the best homage that we can pay to all of the victims of the Second World War is to reaffirm our commitment to work further to bring about peace and security throughout the world. And this is particularly pertinent in the light of the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, which we are also commemorating this year. Madam President, as was recognized by heads of state and government during the Summit of the Future, it is possible to build a better future for all of humanity. And this includes for all of those who are living in poverty or who are particularly vulnerable. The current international context, characterized as it is by increased conflicts, exacerbation of historic crises, except that they are becoming, and indeed they are becoming larger, this gives rise to the feeling that the world is plunged in a permanent state of conflict, which must certainly not grow into any global conflict. To achieve this, we think that urgent measures need to be taken to put an end to this perpetual state of war, which impedes the world from achieving the SDGs. The delegation of Togo calls for respect for state sovereignty and to refrain from any kind of interference in state internal affairs. We call for the complete, immediate, verifiable, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. This remains at the heart of many conflicts and tensions throughout the world. My delegation also calls for the reform of our common organization so that it can better reflect the multilateralism that it promotes today. The Security Council must also be reformed in our eyes in order to make it more representative, given ultimately that this body is at the heart of the efforts to maintain international peace and security. This reform that we are calling for must also relate to the international financial system. That must be made more effective, more equitable, and better tailored to today's world, better able to remedy the difficulties that developing countries are all facing. Lastly, we must have a new global order. In order for crises and conflicts to be overcome, this new order must get rid of all forms of injustice and inequality. And this necessarily involves recognizing the historic facts whose effects linger and which become structural obstacles preventing stability throughout the world. This is the case of historic facts and events such as slavery and colonialism, which have been deemed to be crimes against humanity and genocide by the African Union. like in any crime, there are prejudices, and the prejudices must be repaired. And we think that the UN must be at the heart of these efforts and supporting reparations for these crimes. We're also calling for the reconciliation of memory so that a new order built on lasting peace and understanding can reign between nations. Madam President, the homage that we are paying to the victims of the Second World War today must lead us to ensure that we do, as John Fitzgerald Kennedy has said, humanity must put an end to war, or war will put an end to humanity. End of quotation. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Togo, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it's a great honor to address this solemn meeting of the General Assembly on behalf of the Republic of Uzbekistan on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. 80 years ago, humankind witnessed the end of the bloodiest conflict in history, one that took more than 70 million lives and left deep scars across continents. The terrible cost of that war reminds us of our duty to preserve peace and prevent the resurgence of hatred, aggression, and violence. On this day, we honor the memory of all victims and heroes of the war, soldiers who perished on the battlefield, and civilians who bore the hardship of war with dignity. Among them were the violent sons and daughters of Uzbekistan. From a population of 6.5 million, nearly 2 million were mobilized to the front lines. More than 538,000 gave their lives, and over 158,000 remain missing. These are not just numbers. They represent families, dreams, and sacrifices that will never be forgotten. We mark this day with both pride and sorrow. The bitter trials of war that our people endured are not forgotten, even after all these years. During the war, Uzbekistan became a powerful strategic rear. Over 170 factories and plants were relocated to our country, and production was swiftly resumed to meet the urgent needs of the front. But perhaps the most enduring contribution of our people was humanitarian. More than 1.5 million evacuees found shelter in Uzbekistan, including over 250,000 orphans. They were welcomed into our homes and hearts. Our people displayed exceptional humanism, embracing children who had lost everything and sharing with them even their last piece of bread. Madam President, the legacy of the war is a lesson that lives on. In Uzbekistan, we are deeply committed to preserving the historical truth and passing it on to future generations. We have built the Victory Park Memorial Complex in Tashkent, a symbol of our people's sacrifice and resilience. Our youth must know this history. They must understand that the freedom and peace they enjoy today were won at a tremendous cost. The heroic traditions of our veterans serve as a guiding example for educating young people in the spirit of patriotism, peace, and mutual respect. We believe that instilling this sense of moral responsibility in younger generation is vital, not only for Uzbekistan, but for global peace and solidarity. In this context, Uzbekistan reaffirms its strong commitment to the principles of multilateralism. The enormous human cost of the Second World War underscores the critical importance of collective action and international cooperation. Today, as the world faces complex and interlinked challenges, we must strengthen multilateralism as the foundation of fair, rules-based international order. Only through dialogue and shared responsibility can we build lasting peace and development for all. Distinguished colleagues, As we look to the future, let us remain united in our determination to prevent war, promote dialogue, and strengthen the foundations of international cooperation. Let us honor the past through our actions in the present by standing together in defense of peace, dignity, and humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan. We have heard the last speaker for this meeting. We shall continue the special solemn meeting after the consideration of the items already announced in the Journal of the United Nations. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 135. The meeting stands adjourned.